A former Navy SEAL drove toward his snowbound hometown when something beside the road made him brake. A chained German shepherd curled around her tiny puppy beneath an old shelter, shielding him from snow. As the stranger approached, the exhausted mother rose and placed herself between him and her puppy. The former Navy SEAL stayed calm, soothed the mother, and gently unclipped the chain from her collar. He then learned their owner had vanished after following his late grandfather's warning about an avalanche beacon. His final radio message said the beacon was false, just as another storm began closing in. Stay with this story to the end. Please like and subscribe for more journeys of loyalty and healing. The German shepherd lifted her head before Nolan Barrett understood what he was looking at. Snow moved sideways across the narrow maintenance road, whitening the hood of his pickup almost as quickly as the wipers cleared it. And the old structure beside the road had blended into the trees until something dark shifted beneath its leaning awning. Nolan eased off the accelerator. The dog rose unsteadily, turned broadside to the road, and placed herself over a much smaller shape pressed into the blanket beneath her. Only then did Nolan see the chain running from her collar to a wooden post. He stopped 20 yards farther on. Everpine lay another 4 miles ahead, tucked into a high mountain basin Nolan had not called home in more than 20 years. He could already picture the village: cedar roofs under heavy snow, narrow streets, the old church steeple above the trees, smoke lifting from chimneys into air so cold it seemed to hold every sound. He had planned to reach his parents' empty cabin before dark, get the furnace running, put his bags inside, and speak to as few people as possible. The dog changed that plan before he had even reached town. Nolan stepped from the pickup, wearing a dark moss canvas coat over his olive shirt. Cold slipped immediately beneath his collar. The German shepherd stood despite the effort it cost her. She was female, black and deep honey tan, with a strong black mask and one ear, whose tip leaned slightly outward. Her ribs showed more than they should. Beneath her belly, a 6-week-old puppy pushed closer into the warmth she was trying to preserve. The mother's lips lifted. Nolan stopped. All right. The growl remained low and steady. He had spent enough years around frightened people and working animals to know that moving closer, because you meant well, did not make the movement less threatening. He turned slightly sideways, lowered himself into the snow, removed one glove, and rested his bare hand near his knee. The dog watched every movement. There was no rush in Nolan now. That had not always been true. For several seconds, the wind against his hood sounded too much like static in a headset. Another night returned without invitation. Incomplete information. Aaron Dwyer's voice asking for a few more minutes. Nolan looking at the clock and deciding they did not have them. Move. The decision had taken seconds. The consequences had taken years. Nolan pressed his thumb against the edge of his forefinger until the memory receded. The shepherd stepped forward. The chain tightened. She stopped immediately and looked back at the puppy. That mattered more than the growl. Whatever strength remained in her was being spent on one purpose. You're not worried about me, Nolan murmured. You're worried about him. He waited. Eventually, the dog stretched her neck far enough to smell his fingers. Her nose was cold and dry. Nolan did not touch her. She backed away, checked the puppy, then approached again on her own. Only the second time did Nolan slowly turn his hand upward. The dog smelled his palm and let out a long breath. Nolan moved to the post. The chain had been clipped there properly, not tied in panic. Nearby stood a plastic storage bin lined with a thermal blanket. An empty food bag had been folded against the wall. The water bowl was frozen solid. Nothing about the scene looked careless. Someone had prepared the place for a short stay. Someone had simply failed to return. The shepherd watched while Nolan released the clip. She could have bolted. Instead, she immediately went to the puppy. That settled the matter. Nolan wrapped the little male in the inside of his coat. The puppy made one small, protesting sound, and the mother followed so closely to the pickup that her shoulder brushed Nolan's leg twice. "Yeah," Nolan said. "He's coming too." At the family cabin, Nolan turned the furnace on low instead of trying to heat the room quickly. He found an old ceramic bowl, offered water in small amounts, then divided some plain food into portions. The shepherd ate without lifting her head until the puppy squeaked from the blanket near the stove. She stopped eating, walked to him, checked him. Only then returned to the bowl. Nolan stood at the counter and watched. 3 years earlier, people had told Nolan the investigation was complete. He had acted within the information available. No misconduct, no violation requiring discipline. Aaron Dwyer had still left the Navy because his body could no longer do what it had done before that night. The report had given Nolan permission to continue. He had left instead. His phone still carried Aaron's number. It had also carried missed calls. Nolan never returned until Aaron eventually stopped making them. The shepherd finished eating and looked toward Nolan. "Don't start," he said quietly. Her amber-brown eyes stayed on him. Nolan found the village veterinary clinic through an old directory taped beside the cabin phone. 40 minutes later, he carried the puppy through a blue-painted door while the mother walked beside him. Dr. Maren Holt met them in the examination room. She was 49, compact and steady, with dark hair streaked silver at the temples and rectangular glasses she pushed onto her head when she leaned over the puppy. "Where did you find them?" "Old maintenance shelter on North Spur." Maren stopped. "Which one?" "The one below the avalanche service road." Her expression changed before she said anything. She examined the mother first, moving slowly enough that the shepherd could see each hand. The dog stiffened whenever Maren reached toward the puppy, but never snapped. "Good restraint," Maren said. "She's protecting him." "There's a difference." Nolan glanced at her. Maren gave him a look that suggested she had already noticed more about him than Nolan preferred. Neither dog had a serious injury. The mother was dehydrated, underfed, and exhausted from cold exposure. The puppy was weak, but warm enough, largely because his mother had spent 3 days keeping him that way. Maren scanned the shepherd's microchip. The name appeared. Nell. Owner. Walter Morrow. Nolan knew the surname before Maren spoke. "Walter died 9 days ago," she said. 74. Army veteran. Lived here almost 40 years. Nolan remembered an older man from childhood who kept weather notebooks in his truck and seemed able to tell what a storm would do by watching the ridgeline. Maren looked at the puppy. "Milo. About 6 weeks. Who was looking after them?" "Walter's grandson, Eli." That was when the room became quieter. Maren pulled her glasses down. "Eli Morrow is 29, telecommunications technician. He brought Nell in 2 weeks ago after Milo was born. Asked me more questions in 40 minutes than most new parents ask in a month. So he didn't abandon them." "No." Maren said it with enough certainty to end the possibility. 3 days earlier, Eli had told her he was going up the maintenance route for several hours. Walter had left notes about equipment he wanted checked. The heating system at Walter's cabin was being repaired, so Eli had placed Nell and Milo at the old shelter near his return route, where they had a windbreak, bedding, food, and water. Nell kept trying to follow the snowmobile. Eli had clipped her lead to the post, so she would stay with Milo. "He said he'd be back before dark," Maren said. Nolan looked at Nell. The dog was lying beside Milo now, head raised toward the door. "Nobody searched." "They are searching. They just don't know where to concentrate." Maren explained that Cal Mercer, the county emergency management coordinator who worked with the sheriff for the Everpine area, had opened a missing person case. Weather had prevented a broad mountain search, and Eli had not filed a route. Nolan looked toward the window. "This isn't my business." Mara nodded once. "Probably not." That answer irritated him more than an argument would have. Then she added, "But my overnight ward is full. Nell and Milo need somewhere quiet. You found them, and Nell already tolerates you." Nolan looked down. Nell had moved one front paw over Milo. "I have an empty cabin." "Then it won't be empty." Nolan almost said no. Instead, 20 minutes later, Nell and Milo were back in his truck. By evening, Cal Mercer had called. He was 56, square-faced, short-haired, and carried the tired composure of a man accustomed to coordinating other people's emergencies. He wanted to inspect Walter's cabin again, now that they knew exactly where the dogs had been found. Nolan went because he knew the shelter location. That was the reason he gave himself. Walter's cabin stood dark beneath a bank of fir trees. Nothing inside looked abandoned. A coat hung by the door. Reading glasses rested beside an open weather ledger. A pencil lay across the page as if Walter might return after supper. Cal checked drawers and shelves, while Nolan examined a stack of maintenance notebooks. A small handheld recorder sat beneath them. Cal turned it over. Walter used these for field notes. The most recent recording was dated the morning Eli disappeared. Cal pressed play. For several seconds, there was only clothing movement and distant wind. Then Eli's voice came through, tired but unmistakably alert. "Grandpa, you were right about Beacon 6. It isn't drifting. Someone is changing." A door slammed somewhere near the recorder. The message ended. Cal replayed the final 5 seconds. Nolan stared at the device. He had returned to Everpine intending to close a cabin door behind himself. Instead, Nell and Milo were waiting inside that cabin. Eli Morrow was somewhere on the mountain, and a dead man's notes had just become part of a missing person investigation. Nolan looked at Cal. "What's Beacon 6? Cal slipped the recorder into an evidence bag. "Tomorrow," he said. "We find out." By 8 the next morning, a relief map of Everpine covered half the wall of the county emergency room, and Nolan Barrett was beginning to understand why nobody had simply driven up the mountain to look for Eli Morrow. 9 small red marks formed an uneven ring around the village, each one numbered and connected by thin lines to weather stations, radio repeaters, access roads, and avalanche paths. Rachel Boone stood in front of the map, with one hand braced against the table. At 41, she had the compact endurance of someone who spent more time climbing slopes than talking about them. Her copper-brown hair was tied low behind her neck, and a rust-colored shell hung open over a burgundy base layer. Cal Mercer had introduced her as Everpine's avalanche specialist and the volunteer mountain rescue leader. Rachel had introduced herself by telling Nolan what he was not allowed to do. "You were a SEAL," she said. "That doesn't make you an avalanche technician." Nolan leaned against the table. "I didn't say it did." "Good. If you go uphill with my team, you're auxiliary support. You carry, drive, observe, and follow the route I give you. Cal handles incident coordination. I handle the mountain." Nolan felt the old resistance before he could stop it. Not anger, exactly. Something more familiar. The instinct to take responsibility before anyone else could take it away. 3 years of avoiding command had not erased the habit of wanting control when consequences became real. "Understood," he said. Rachel studied him for another second, apparently deciding whether the word meant what it sounded like. Then she turned to the map. Beacon 6 sat high on West Bowl, a broad white slope northwest of Everpine. Rachel traced a gloved finger down from the beacon to West Pass Road, which crossed lower terrain beneath the bowl's possible runout zone. Fuel trucks, food deliveries, pharmacy shipments, and winter service vehicles used that road whenever the eastern route was closed. Above it, separated by elevation and terrain, high basin winter tours ran snowcat excursions across safer sections of the upper ridge when conditions allowed. Same mountain, Rachel said. Different routes. Same data affects both. The 9 beacon stations measured snowfall, wind, temperature changes, and conditions within the snowpack. Rachel interpreted those readings with field observations and made safety recommendations. Everpine's administration issued formal closures. Maintenance belonged to the Everpine Winter Access Cooperative, a local contractor with technicians authorized to calibrate and repair the equipment. And Russ Cade runs the cooperative, Cal said. Rachel nodded. He also owns High Basin Winter Tours. Nolan looked from the red mark on the map to the tour route drawn above it. So the man maintaining the alarm makes money when the mountain stays open. He doesn't decide whether it's safe, Rachel said. At least, he's not supposed to. She did not sound accusatory. That made the statement carry more weight. Everpine had fewer people than some city apartment blocks. The same mechanic repaired county plows and private tractors. Volunteer firefighters ran businesses. A man could own the company maintaining a system and still be the only qualified technician available for 30 miles. Rachel had disliked the arrangement for years, but disliking a small-town compromise was different from proving it had failed. They returned to Walter Morrow's cabin before noon. Daylight changed the place. The night before, it had felt preserved by grief. Now it looked interrupted. Eli's pickup sat beneath an open-sided shed, with snow gathered evenly across the hood. Cal checked the registration and mileage, while Rachel went through the mudroom. Nolan noticed a phone charger plugged beside the kitchen counter, an overnight bag folded empty in a closet, and 2 heavy winter shirts hanging from hooks near the back door. Eli had not packed for an absence. Even his everyday work gloves were missing, while the thicker pair he used for longer mountain trips remained on the shelf. A few hours, Rachel said after looking around. Maybe half a day. That matched what Marin had told them. It also made 3 missing nights harder to explain. Walter's workroom occupied what had once been a small bedroom. Shelves held binders, weather notebooks, rulers, replacement batteries, old maps, and mechanical pencils sharpened to nearly identical lengths. Rachel did not start with the recorder. She opened Walter's most recent field ledger and began reading rows of numbers. Nolan stood behind her, long enough for them to become more than numbers. Walter had written machine readings in one column and his own field measurements beside them. For months, the two remained close. Then Beacon 6 began reporting slightly less snowfall than Walter recorded by hand. Later came wind readings that did not quite match. The differences were small enough to dismiss individually. Walter had not dismissed them. He circled each one. Sensor drift, Nolan asked. Possible, Rachel said. Ice, age, calibration error. One bad reading doesn't mean anything. Cal pointed farther down the page. That's a lot of bad readings. Rachel kept reading. Several larger discrepancies occurred on Fridays and Saturdays. Nolan looked toward the wall calendar Walter had left open beside the desk. High Basin Winter Tours had handwritten reservation numbers on some of the same dates. Rachel noticed him noticing. Don't build a case out of a calendar, she said. I'm not. You were about to. Nolan almost answered, then stopped. She was right. That irritated him less than it had that morning. The back door opened. A man stamped snow from his boots and called Cal's name before entering the workroom. Russell Cade was 52, broad through the shoulders, with steel gray hair brushed neatly to one side and a short salt and pepper beard that looked maintained even in a storm. His navy winter coat carried the small High Basin logo over one chest. He had the easy manner of someone used to walking into rooms where everyone already knew him. "I heard you found Walter's dogs," he said to Nolan. "Good thing you came along when you did." Nolan said nothing about luck. Russ turned to Rachel. "Any word on Eli?" "Not yet." Something tightened around Russ's eyes, brief enough to be mistaken for fatigue. "Kid shouldn't have gone up alone." Rachel closed the ledger. "Did you know he was going?" "Knew he was asking questions. Walter left him half a library of them." Russ had brought a folder. He handed it to Cal without ceremony. Inside was an old system authorization bearing Walter Morrow's name and signature. Rachel read it twice. The document approved a temporary manual override at Beacon 6. Nolan glanced back toward the ledger. Until then, Walter had occupied a comfortable role in the story. The careful old veteran who noticed something wrong, wrote it down, and left Eli to finish what he had begun. The signature complicated that picture immediately. "Walter approved changing the threshold?" Nolan asked. Russ rested one hand on the back of a chair. "Years ago. Weather stations aren't scripture. Sometimes people on the ground know what the instruments don't." Rachel looked up. "Why bring this now?" "Because you're reading his notebooks like he never trusted an override. He did." Russ's tone remained calm. "Whatever Eli thought he found, don't turn Walter into somebody he wasn't." He left shortly afterward, saying he had crews waiting for a decision on afternoon maintenance. No threat, no confrontation, just an old piece of paper on the table and a dead man's signature beneath it. Nolan returned to his cabin near dusk to check Nell and Milo, while Rachel continued working through Walter's records. Marin had dropped off food and instructions. Milo was asleep in a folded blanket near the stove, his oversized front paws stretched toward the warmth. Nell rose when Nolan entered, watched him remove his coat, then checked the bundle before approaching. Nolan had brought one of Eli's old work jackets with Cal's permission, hoping a familiar scent might settle her. He placed it on the floor instead of pushing it toward her. Nell froze. Her nose worked once, twice. Then she crossed the room quickly and buried her muzzle in the fabric. She followed the scent from sleeve to collar, turned, and went directly to the front door. Nell sat facing it. Nolan waited. After nearly a minute, she returned to Milo, touched her nose to his side, then walked back to the door and sat again. There was nothing mysterious in it. Nell knew Eli's smell. She knew doors. She knew that the person attached to that scent had left and hadn't come back. Nolan crouched beside her without touching her. For the first time since hearing Eli's recording, the missing man stopped feeling like a name on Cal's file. Rachel called before Nolan had taken off his boots. "Come back to Walter's." Her voice had changed. When Nolan arrived, Rachel had 3 ledgers open across the dining table. She pointed to a line Walter had written in pencil beside a maintenance entry several years after the override Russ had shown them. "I signed it once. Russ knows why. Never again." Cal set Russ's authorization beside the notebook. The dates did not match the story the document seemed to tell. Walter's handwritten refusal came first. The authorization bearing Walter's signature had been used years later. Nolan stared at the 2 pieces of paper. A signature could be real and still be used to tell a lie. A man could make one decision and spend years being defined by it. Nolan knew too well how easily a complicated life could collapse around a single choice. Rachel tapped the older authorization. "We need to know why Walter signed the first one." Nolan looked at Beacon 6, marked on the map Cal had brought from the emergency office. Yesterday the question had been where Eli went. Now they had part of the answer. Eli had gone toward a system Walter once trusted enough to override, and later distrusted enough to write, in his own hand, "Never again." 7 years earlier, an ambulance had crossed West Pass, because Walter Morrow decided a red warning light was not the same thing as a closed mountain. Rachel Boone found the incident buried in a county archive that had never been digitized properly, stored between bridge inspections and winter fuel invoices in the basement of Everpine's municipal building. By mid-morning, she had spread the old reports across a steel work table, while Cal Mercer read from the dispatch log. Nolan Barrett stood near the wall, listening rather than touching anything. The storm that winter had isolated Everpine for almost 2 days. A 68-year-old resident had developed a medical emergency that the village clinic could not manage. Helicopters could not fly. The eastern road had already closed. West Pass was the only possible route, and Beacon 6 had pushed the bowl above the automatic warning threshold. Walter had gone up himself. He measured the snowpack manually, checked the wind-loaded ridge, and returned convinced that a narrow window existed before conditions worsened. Russ Cade had been running plow operations then. Together, they authorized a temporary override. The ambulance crossed. The road closed again less than 2 hours later. The patient survived. Cal set down the dispatch sheet. People still talk about it. Rachel nodded. Usually as proof Walter trusted judgment over machinery. But that's not what happened, Nolan said. Rachel slid another page toward him. It was Walter's follow-up report, written 3 days after the rescue. Walter had not celebrated the override. He had recommended that future manual changes require 2 independent approvals, 1 technical and 1 safety-related. He had also asked that every override create a permanent off-site record that could not be altered by the person making the change. Nolan read the final paragraph twice. Walter had not learned that rules were unnecessary. Walter had learned that exceptions needed stronger rules around them. Was any of this adopted? Nolan asked. Partly, Rachel said. The form changed. The software didn't. Everpine had replaced hardware over the years, without rebuilding the underlying access structure. Technicians still needed emergency credentials because storms damaged sensors, power supplies failed, and mountain roads could not wait 3 days for an outside contractor. On paper, every significant adjustment required administrative approval. In practice, the same small group of people had worked together long enough that trust often replaced verification. Rachel opened a newer maintenance summary. The first questionable override after Walter's emergency decision lasted 32 minutes. It occurred during a holiday weekend. The next one lasted 90. Months later, a system note described a 4-hour change as temporary calibration compensation. None produced an accident. That absence had become its own kind of evidence. Not proof that the changes were safe, Rachel explained, but enough to make people stop feeling uneasy. Nolan understood that progression better than he wanted to. A decision survived once, so the next decision felt easier. A boundary moved slightly, then slightly again, until one day everyone remembered the new line, but nobody remembered who had moved it. Rachel switched to a terminal connected to the current Beacon network. She ran a history check against maintenance schedules. Beacon 3 showed 2 commands outside scheduled service. Beacon 8 showed 4. Beacon 6 showed the most. Cal leaned over her shoulder. Same user? Not enough retained data to say. The central server kept detailed command logs only for a limited period before overwriting them. That policy had been designed when storage was expensive, and nobody imagined an old weather network would become part of a missing person investigation. Rachel pulled a topographic map from a cabinet and marked a point north of West Bowl. The long archive isn't here. Nolan looked at the mark. An older relay station on the north slope received periodic backup copies, because the network once depended on radio links that failed during heavy storms. The station had been left in place even after upgrades. It was inefficient, outdated, and useful precisely because nobody relied on it day to day. If the archive still works, Cal said. If, Rachel agreed. Nolan looked at the clock above the emergency room door. Eli had already been missing 3 nights. What do we need to get there? Rachel did not answer immediately. She walked to the window instead. Loose snow lifted from the courthouse roof and vanished sideways between the buildings. We don't go today. Nolan thought he had misheard her. The relay station could tell us what Eli was looking at. It could. And Eli may be somewhere between Beacon 6 and that station. Also true. So we go. Rachel turned. No. The word was quiet. That made Nolan's shoulders tighten more than if she had shouted. Rachel showed him the latest field observations. Wind had shifted overnight and loaded a series of northeast-facing slopes. Fresh snow sat over an older hard layer. Nothing on the page meant much to Nolan until Rachel drew one line across the map. This section is the problem. I won't put a search team under it this afternoon. Then send fewer people. Fewer people still get buried. Cal looked between them but did not intervene. Nolan felt urgency harden into something cleaner and more dangerous. Eli was 29 years old, 3 nights outside. Every hour mattered. Nolan could see a snowmobile through the open equipment bay door. He knew enough of the old maintenance roads to reach the lower ridge. He had crossed worse terrain and worse weather with less information. That thought stopped him. Less information. The room seemed to shrink. He did not need the whole memory. Aaron's voice arrived by itself. Wait. Not fear. Not hesitation. A professional judgment Nolan had overridden because the clock was moving. Rachel watched him carefully. If Eli is alive, Nolan said, another night matters. I know. You don't sound like it. Something changed in Rachel's face, but her voice stayed level. That's the problem with urgency. It makes the person feeling it believe nobody else feels enough. Nolan said nothing. Rachel stepped closer to the map. You want me to prove I care by moving now? I want to bring Eli back without creating 2 more people Cal has to search for. The snowmobile remained visible beyond her shoulder. Nolan could take it. He knew that. Cal knew it too. Nobody moved to block him. For several long seconds, Nolan stood with the same choice in a different room, on a different mountain, with nobody shooting and no mission clock running except the one inside his own head. Then Nolan looked at Rachel. What do you need? She paused. For what? To go tomorrow. Safely. The tension left the room by degrees. Rachel showed him the forecast. Overnight temperatures were expected to stabilize the upper layer, while the wind should weaken before dawn. If the field team confirmed the change at first light, they would have a limited window to search the route between Beacon 6, Summit 9, and the North Relay approach. Cal began assigning support. Nolan would drive 1 snowmobile carrying equipment and emergency supplies. Rachel would lead route selection. 2 local rescue volunteers would accompany them. Nolan could advise on old trail landmarks he remembered from growing up near the mountain, but Rachel would decide where the team traveled and when it stopped. That's the arrangement, Rachel said. Nolan nodded. This time the word felt different. By late afternoon, he returned to the cabin long enough to feed Nell and Milo. Nell had more strength than the day before. She finished her portion, checked Milo, then settled near the stove rather than the front door. Nolan packed his mountain gear at the kitchen table while Milo struggled onto Nolan's discarded boot, failed, and fell asleep with one oversized paw across the leather. Nell watched Nolan roll a thermal layer into his pack. You stay here, Nolan said. Her ears shifted at his voice. No heroics. Nolan almost smiled at the hypocrisy. He left extra instructions for Marin, who had agreed to check both dogs while the team was out. At the emergency center, Cal was testing radios when an old repeater file finally finished restoring from backup. A technician had recovered several corrupted fragments from the night Eli disappeared. Most contained only static. One did not. Cal raised a hand for silence and played it through the room speaker. Wind distorted the first words. Then Eli's voice emerged. 6 is false. Walt was right. A burst of interference swallowed several seconds. Eli came back louder. It's not only 6. Check the signal vanished. Rachel replayed it. Then again. Nothing followed the final word. Nolan looked at the marked map on the wall. Beacon 3. Beacon 6. Beacon 8. The relay station. They had spent the day trying to understand why Walter once approved an exception. Now Eli had confirmed the problem had grown beyond that single decision. Rachel switched off the speaker and picked up a marker. At dawn, they would stop reading what the mountain had recorded. They would go ask the mountain itself. At first light, Rachel Boone drove a snow probe into the slope above the maintenance yard and listened to the sound it made. Nolan Barrett stood 10 feet away beside the loaded snowmobile, watching her cut a small test section into the new snow while 2 rescue volunteers checked radios and packs. The wind had weakened during the night. The temperature had dropped enough to tighten the upper layer, but Rachel still worked slowly, comparing what she saw beneath the surface with readings from a handheld meter. Only when she was satisfied did she stand and look toward West Bowl. "We have a window," she said. "That doesn't mean we have permission to get stupid." Nolan pulled on his gloves. "Wouldn't dream of it." Rachel gave him a brief look that suggested she had already considered the possibility. Cal Mercer remained at the emergency center below, maintaining contact with the sheriff's office and tracking the team's position. Rachel led. Nolan drove the second snowmobile with emergency gear strapped behind him. The 2 local rescuers followed in another machine. The route did not go directly toward Beacon 6. Rachel kept them below the more exposed slopes, crossing sections of forest where the trees broke the wind and the snowpack was more predictable. Several times Nolan saw an older service track he remembered from childhood and started to point toward it. Rachel checked the terrain before either accepting or rejecting the suggestion. Nolan did not argue when she rejected 2 of them. That, by itself, felt unfamiliar. They reached the lower approach to Beacon 6 a little before 9. The instrument mast stood above the white slope like a thin black needle. Rachel did not take the team all the way to it. The purpose was finding Eli, not inspecting equipment before they knew the route he had traveled. Instead, they followed the last useful information they had. Eli's radio transmission, the estimated battery level of the old repeater, Walter's maps, and a maintenance path running northwest toward 2 secondary structures. Fresh snow had erased almost everything. Then one of the rescuers found a shallow depression protected beneath a stand of firs, a snowmobile track. Not enough to follow continuously, but enough to establish direction. Rachel crouched over it, checked the map, and drew a line with her finger. If he left 6 this way, Summit 9 is closer than the north relay. Nolan looked uphill. Still active? Barely. Weather observation only. Nobody staffs it. They changed course. Summit 9 appeared almost an hour later as a low concrete and timber structure built into the shoulder of the mountain. Snow had climbed halfway up one wall. The main door was nearly buried. Nolan was off his machine before Rachel finished signaling the stop. She caught his sleeve. "Check the roof first." He stopped. Snow had accumulated heavily along one side. Rachel studied the overhang, chose the safer approach, and directed them toward a narrow service entrance protected by a rock wall. Nolan and one rescuer cleared packed snow from the door with short shovels, while Rachel continued monitoring the slope above them. The door moved 2 inches, then stopped. Something blocked it from inside. Nolan put his shoulder against it carefully. A weak voice answered from the other side. "Don't break it. The bench is against it." Everything changed at once without anyone needing to say the name. "Eli," Nolan called. A pause. "Depends who wants to know." Rachel closed her eyes for half a second in relief. "Rachel Boone." From inside came something between a laugh and a cough. "About time." They opened the door, enough to move the bench, and found Eli Morrow sitting on the floor beneath 2 thermal blankets. At 29, he looked younger than Nolan had expected. Thin-faced, beneath several days of stubble. Sandy brown hair flattened beneath a navy knit cap. His lips were dry and his movements slow, but his eyes were clear. Rachel immediately shifted from search leader to patient assessment. Eli could answer questions. He knew where he was. He had been drinking from sealed emergency water packets and eating ration bars stored in the station. Walter's doing. Shelves along one wall held labeled plastic bins containing blankets, batteries, first aid supplies, and old emergency food. "My grandfather thought every mountain building should be ready to become a shelter," Eli said. Nolan looked at the neat labels written in mechanical pencil. Walter had been dead 9 days. His habits were still taking care of people. Rachel radioed Cal. "We have Eli, conscious, ambulatory with assistance. No major injury visible. We're warming him and coming down slow." Cal's answer arrived through static, relief audible even through the formal language. Eli drank warm electrolyte solution before Rachel allowed him to say much more. Nolan expected impatience from him. Instead, Eli kept looking at the door, as if part of him still expected someone else to enter. When Rachel finally asked what happened at Beacon 6, Eli pointed toward an old tablet charging from the station's backup battery. "My grandfather kept saying 6 wasn't drifting." "You checked it?" Rachel asked. "I checked the configuration." Eli explained carefully. Telecommunications was his trade. He did not know enough about avalanche science to challenge Walter's field measurements, but he knew network hardware. Beacon 6 contained a configuration module with a firmware profile that did not match the version listed in Walter's maintenance inventory. Eli accessed the diagnostic screen and found threshold values different from those in the official configuration sheet. He had photographed the screen, then synchronized what he could to Walter's tablet at Summit 9 because he did not trust the central server to keep older changes. "Why Summit 9? "Grandpa used it as a backup drop. Old system. Nobody bothers with it." Rachel and Nolan exchanged a look. Walter had been building redundancy long before anyone called the differences suspicious. Eli's expression hardened. "Russ came up while I was at 6. Nolan did not interrupt. Russ had told Eli he was misunderstanding the system. Temporary adjustments happened all the time. Walter himself had used them. Eli said Walter's later notes showed that was exactly what Walter had wanted. Stopped. The argument escalated, not into a fight, into something smaller and, in Nolan's mind, uglier. Russ took Eli's phone and the key to his snowmobile. "He said I could walk the South Service Trail and cool off. Said he'd meet me below and give everything back." Rachel stared at him. "During an incoming front?" "He thought we had hours." Russ had been wrong. The temperature fell faster than forecast. Visibility deteriorated. Eli started down on foot, realized the South Trail was being buried, and turned back toward Summit 9 because Walter had once shown him the station. By then, Russ was gone. Eli got the old emergency radio working long enough to transmit one broken message. "Why didn't Russ report you missing?" Nolan asked. Eli looked at him for a long moment. "Because then, somebody would ask why he took my phone." The room became quiet. That was the point where Nolan understood the shape of the mistake. Russ might not have intended to leave Eli trapped for 3 days. But once the weather changed, admitting Eli was missing meant admitting what had happened at Beacon 6. The first bad decision had created a second decision, and the second needed silence. Eli reached for the tablet. "There's more." Rachel sat beside him while he opened the saved configuration images. Beacon 6 was there. So were 2 partial records Walter had copied from earlier maintenance sessions. Beacon 3, Beacon 8. The thresholds differed from the official values on all 3. Rachel's face tightened. "Can you tell who changed them?" "Some. A few commands were associated with maintenance credentials belonging to the cooperative Russ ran. Others were not." Eli opened a cached authorization log. Several entries had been confirmed through a terminal ID registered to Everpine's municipal office. Nolan leaned closer. "So Russ didn't have to do all of this alone." "I didn't say somebody else changed the numbers," Eli replied. "I'm saying somebody kept approving the access." That distinction mattered. Rachel copied the tablet data before they left. The descent took longer than the climb because Eli tired easily, and Rachel refused to turn a successful search into an evacuation mistake. Nolan carried extra gear while one rescuer rode beside Eli. By early afternoon, Everpine's roofs appeared through the trees below. At Marinholt's clinic, Nolan entered behind Eli. Nell heard Eli before she saw him. Her head rose from beside Milo. Then she stood. For one heartbeat, she looked down at the puppy. Then she moved toward the hallway. Eli stopped when Nell appeared. "Nell." The German shepherd crossed the distance quickly, but without jumping. She pressed her nose into his hands, then his coat, then against his chin as he lowered himself carefully to the floor. Eli wrapped one arm around her shoulders. Nell stayed there long enough to satisfy herself. Then she turned back. She returned to Milo, touched her nose to the puppy's side, and looked toward Eli again. Eli understood. He moved closer until Nell could lie between him and Milo. Nolan remained near the doorway. For 3 years he had told himself that disappearing from Aaron's life had been an act of responsibility. Aaron had suffered because of Nolan's decision. The least Nolan could do was stop asking Aaron to carry Nolan too. Watching Nell move back toward Eli, Nolan saw the flaw in that logic more clearly than he wanted. Nell had never decided Eli was better off without her. She had waited. Eli's eyes were already closing when Cal arrived to take a formal preliminary statement. Eli managed only one more thing before exhaustion won. "Russ changed the numbers." Cal nodded. Eli opened his eyes again. "But somebody kept giving him permission." Cal glanced at Rachel. Rachel looked toward the municipal terminal ID on the copied log. Finding Eli had answered the question that brought them onto the mountain. It had also made the problem larger than the mountain. Judith Hale did not deny signing the authorizations. By 10 the next morning, she had placed 12 printed forms in a straight line across the conference table in Everpine's municipal office, removed her burgundy reading glasses, and looked at Rachel Boone without trying to make the papers disappear through explanation. At 59, Judith had spent more than 20 years keeping a small mountain village, functioning with too few people and too many responsibilities. Her silver-gray hair was cut neatly at her jaw, and everything about her office, from labeled folders to the sharpened pencils beside the telephone, suggested a woman who disliked unfinished work. "Those signatures are mine," she said. Cal Mercer stood at the end of the table, while Eli Morrow, still pale from 3 nights at Summit 9, sat with a blanket over his knees. Nolan Barrett remained near the window. Rachel compared the municipal terminal log from Walter's tablet with the forms Judith had signed. None said lower avalanche threshold. They said temporary field correction, sensor calibration, or maintenance override. Judith was not an avalanche specialist. Russ Cade was the man responsible for maintaining the equipment, and for years he had presented the changes as short technical adjustments. Sometimes Judith had called Rachel, Sometimes Russ had assured her the change was too small to affect safety decisions. Sometimes businesses were calling because a weekend route had closed, hotel rooms were being canceled, and workers were being sent home. He'd say, "I take responsibility," Judith said. Rachel's expression remained still. "And you let him?" Judith looked down at the papers. "Yes." No bribe, no hidden partnership, no secret meeting. That made the truth harder to package neatly. Everpine had built a system in which expertise, trust, money, and public safety overlapped until people stopped noticing where one person's authority ended. Rachel did not wait for the investigation to finish. Data from beacons 3, 6, and 8 could no longer be treated as reliable until an independent inspection compared the hardware, configurations, and retained logs. She formally recommended closing West Bowles tour route and West Pass Road. Cal used county emergency authority to issue the temporary closure. By noon, the consequences were visible on Main Street. The High Basin booking office taped cancellations to its window. A fuel carrier and 2 delivery trucks were held at the lower checkpoint. The diner reduced its menu because its refrigerated shipment might not arrive. A pharmacy clerk called Cal twice about medication expected on that afternoon's truck. Men who drove snowcats for Russ stood outside the hardware store asking whether they would have work tomorrow. Nolan watched the village turn a technical problem into something people could feel in their paychecks, furnaces, and kitchen cupboards. It was easier to demand absolute safety when someone else absorbed the cost. The community meeting was moved from the municipal office to the volunteer fire hall because too many people came. Folding chairs filled the room. Wet coats steamed near the heaters. People Nolan remembered only as children now owned motels, plowed roads, taught school, or had gray in their hair. Eli sat near Marin Holt because she had threatened to send him back to the clinic if he tried to stand too long. Rachel presented only what they could prove. 3 beacons had operated with thresholds that did not match official technical records. Some maintenance commands were tied to the cooperative Russ managed. Administrative approvals had passed through Judith's office without full technical review. The old system did not preserve enough central data to establish every change yet. That restraint cost Rachel support. A man from the back asked the question several others were thinking. "Has anybody been hurt because of these adjustments?" Rachel answered plainly. "Not that we can establish." Murmurs moved across the room. Russ Cade arrived late enough that people noticed, but early enough to hear the question. He removed his navy coat, stood rather than taking a chair, and did not pretend the overrides never happened. "Walter Morrow made one himself," Russ said. "Rachel has rejected machine readings and used field measurements. Judith signed adjustments. I've spent 20 years getting people through winters when equipment freezes, drifts, fails, or gives us readings that don't match what's in front of our faces." Several heads nodded. Russ did not need to invent his history. He had cleared roads after storms. His company had loaned machines during emergencies. Families in the room depended on his payroll. "If every adjustment I made was reckless," he continued, "then explain the last several years. Hundreds of trips, supply vehicles, tour runs, no avalanche on those routes." Rachel answered from the front. "The absence of a disaster doesn't prove the risk was acceptable." "No," Russ said, "but it does prove judgment matters." That was the argument's strength. He was not asking people to believe danger did not exist. He was asking them to believe he had been good at judging it. Then Russ looked at Nolan. The shift was small, but Nolan felt the room change before Russ spoke. "We also have a man who knows something about judgment under pressure." Nolan's stomach tightened. A few people turned toward him. Russ had spent the last days asking questions. Nolan already knew a local veteran had spoken with him about the Barrett family and the public notice surrounding Aaron Dwyer's medical separation from service. Russ did not know classified details. He did not need them. Nolan made a call on a mission, Russ said. A teammate paid for it with his career. Yet we're supposed to accept his view of what responsible decision-making looks like. Cal stepped forward. This meeting is about the beacon system. It is, Russ said. And about whether one bad outcome makes a man unfit to decide anything again. Nolan's first instinct was to leave. The door was 20 feet away. For 3 years he had survived questions by giving people nothing to hold. Silence could look like discipline from a distance. Up close, Nolan finally understood. It had mostly been hiding. He stood. Aaron Dwyer told me to wait, Nolan said. The room settled. Our information was incomplete. I decided moving was the safer choice. I was wrong. No explanation followed. No list of operational pressures. No reminder that an investigation had cleared him. Aaron got hurt. He had to leave the Navy. I can't change that. Russ folded his arms. Then you understand. I understand making a decision you have to live with. Russ gave a slight nod. Nolan continued. What I didn't do was change the report so my decision would look better. I didn't rewrite what Aaron said. I didn't change the information we had afterward, so I could claim I had been right all along. The nod disappeared. Russ said, So you think that makes you noble? No. The answer came easily. I did something else. I ran. For the first time, Nolan said it without disguising it as resignation, discipline, or punishment. I stopped answering Aaron. I left the work. I let shame make decisions for me because I didn't trust myself to make any more. Nobody applauded. Nolan was grateful for that. He looked at Russ. A mistake isn't permission to keep making everyone else live inside it. The meeting ended without unity. Some people still wanted West Pass reopened. Others demanded every beacon be shut down immediately. Judith stayed behind to help Cal locate older authorizations. Rachel left to update the weather team. Everpine had not chosen a side so much as lost the comfort of believing there were only 2. At Marin's clinic, Eli pulled on his rust-brown work jacket before Nolan could stop him. I'm going to talk to Russ. You're going to sit down. He left me up there. Eli's voice sharpened. He moved toward the hallway. Nell rose beside Milo. Her ears came forward. Eli's movements were fast, his shoulders tight, and his voice louder than it had been since returning. Nell crossed the doorway and stood sideways in front of him. Nell, move. She stayed where she was. No growl, no bared teeth. Her body simply occupied the space between Eli and the door, while Milo remained behind her on the blanket. Eli exhaled hard. Nell looked up at him. Another few seconds passed before Eli lowered himself onto the bench beside her. Fine. Nell immediately relaxed enough to turn her head toward Milo. Nolan watched Eli place a hand on her shoulder. The dog had not understood Russ, revenge, or consequences. She had understood tension and departure. Eli had understood the invitation to stop. Rachel entered before anyone could speak again, carrying a weather tablet. The front accelerated. Cal came behind her, already using his radio. How much? Hours, not morning. Cal called the lower West Pass checkpoint. His expression changed as he listened. A fuel truck, a refrigerated food carrier, and a medical supply vehicle had already passed the lower staging area before the closure notice reached every driver. Cal ordered them to turn around. Rachel opened the network status page. West Pass showed green. She stared at it. I closed that route recommendation. Cal checked the county order. It's still legally closed. Then somebody reopened the technical access state. Rachel pulled the most recent command log onto the screen. The credential appeared at the bottom. Arcade. Maintenance Administrator. Outside, wind struck the clinic windows, hard enough to shake loose snow from the eaves. Nolan looked from Russ's name to the darkening street beyond the glass. The argument in the fire hall was over. Now the mountain would answer. By the time the storm reached West Bowl, nobody in Everpine trusted a green light anymore. Rachel Boone stood beneath a portable canopy at the upper emergency staging point, one hand holding a field notebook, flat against the wind, while another rescue volunteer read manual snow measurements into the radio. The automatic network still transmitted numbers, but Rachel treated them as background noise. She compared the new snowfall against Walter Morrow's old terrain maps, the slope angles marked in pencil, and what her own team could see with their eyes. Below the mountain, Cal Mercer had turned the municipal building into an emergency center. Judith Hale was moving cots and blankets into the community hall in case West Pass remained closed overnight. Marin Holt had opened the clinic's back rooms for elderly residents who might need medication or heat. Eli Morrow, still too weak to be anywhere near the mountain, sat beside the radio equipment and helped keep an aging repeater stable whenever the storm interfered with the signal. Nolan Barrett had one assignment: move equipment where Rachel needed it. Nothing more. That simplicity had once felt like a demotion. Today it felt almost like relief. Rachel sent Nolan along a sheltered service route with spare batteries, rescue blankets, and a compact field kit strapped behind his snowmobile. Halfway to the next staging point, Cal's voice broke through the radio. "We have movement near the north relay." Nolan slowed. "Russ?" Deputy on the lower service road saw a snowcat registered to High Basin turn toward the relay approach. Cade was driving. Nolan looked uphill through the blowing snow. The old relay station sat beyond a ridge to his right. Walter's long-term backup logs could still be there. If Russ reached them first, he might destroy the cleanest record they had of who changed the beacon configurations and when. "I'm 6 minutes from the junction," Nolan said. "I can reach the relay before he gets back down." Cal did not answer immediately. "Deputy Foster is covering the lower exit. Do not freelance this." Nolan could already see the fork ahead. Right went toward the relay station. Left descended toward the West Pass service line and Rachel's rescue sector. The old instinct was immediate and almost comforting. Move fast, close distance, solve the problem before it widened. Then another transmission cut across the channel. "Rachel, Convoy 3 is stopped. Repeat, Convoy 3 is stopped." The voice belonged to one of the county road crews. Rachel answered at once. "Location." "Marker 17. Slide debris behind them. Forward section is loading fast. 3 vehicles, 4 drivers. No injuries." Nolan stared at the fork. Marker 17 lay left. The relay station lay right. Cal's voice came through again. "Nolan, hold position until Rachel assigns you." 3 years earlier, Aaron Dwyer had asked him to wait for better information. Nolan had looked at a clock, looked at the mission objective, and decided delay was the greater danger. He had believed speed would protect everyone. Now there were 4 people trapped between unstable sections of West Pass, and 1 man, uphill, who might carry evidence capable of ending the investigation. The choice lasted only a few seconds. "Rachel," Nolan said, "I'm dropping the relay. Send me to Convoy 3. There was no praise in her response. "Copy. Take the lower maintenance spur. Stay below the marked tree line. Macklin's bringing a snowcat from the garage. You meet him at 17 and follow my route instructions. Understood." Nolan turned left. The mountain did not care what the decision meant to him. That helped. At Marker 17, the 3 supply vehicles were boxed between 2 problems. Behind them, a shallow slide had spilled packed snow across the road. Ahead, wind was depositing fresh snow beneath a steep section Rachel no longer trusted. The drivers stood near the vehicles in winter gear, frightened, but unhurt. 1 truck carried heating fuel. Another carried refrigerated food. The third held pharmacy shipments and medical supplies. A broad yellow snowcat appeared through the trees minutes later, driven by Tom Macklin, a garage owner Nolan vaguely remembered as a skinny teenager, and now recognized as a heavy-shouldered man in his 50s, with frost on his beard. Tom did not waste time on reunion. Rachel says we don't clear forward. Nolan nodded. We pull them back to the maintenance shed. The old shed lay lower and partly protected by timber. Rachel directed every movement by radio. Tom packed a stable return lane, while Nolan moved between drivers, checking that each understood the order, and that nobody tried to save time by improvising. One refrigerated truck could not reverse cleanly through the narrowed section, so they unloaded part of its weight into the Snowcat cargo bay before moving it. The process was slow. Nolan felt impatience rise every time the wind changed. He did nothing with it. At the emergency center, Eli kept the repeater alive long enough for Judith to coordinate shelter space and Marin to confirm which medication boxes needed priority once the convoy reached safety. People who had argued in the fire hall the night before now worked from the same radio net because the storm gave them no room for ideology. The last vehicle reached the maintenance shed shortly after dust-colored clouds swallowed the afternoon light. Rachel ordered everyone inside. Less than 15 minutes later, a low rumble traveled across the valley. Nobody saw the beginning. They saw the result. A shallow sheet of snow crossed the section of road the convoy had occupied and buried the tire tracks beneath a fresh, white slope. Tom stared through the shed window. That would have been us. Nolan said nothing. For years he had imagined the past as proof that somewhere inside him was a defect waiting to make the same choice again. The snow outside offered no absolution, only evidence. This time, he had chosen differently. Cal called once the convoy was secure. Foster blocked Cade's lower exit. Russ turned back toward the relay. Rachel's team is going up. Nolan looked toward Rachel. She nodded. Now we finish it. The relay station had been built into the north slope decades earlier, a squat structure with a low equipment wing and a taller radio room. Rachel had warned during planning that the side annex roof was no longer rated for deep accumulation. By the time they arrived with Deputy Foster, snow had piled heavily against the eastern wall. Russ's Snowcat sat outside. The side door would not open. A section of the annex roof had sagged under the weight, twisting the frame enough to trap the exit. Russ answered when Foster called through the wall. "I'm fine. Door's jammed." Rachel circled to a safer service hatch on the opposite side. Nolan helped anchor a rescue line while Foster documented the scene, and Cal coordinated remotely. They did not rush the damaged section. Rachel chose the access point. Nolan followed. When Russ finally emerged through the service hatch, snow covered one shoulder of his navy parka. He looked exhausted rather than defeated. His eyes settled on Nolan. "You could have come here first." Nolan knew what he meant. "You would have caught me before the deputy boxed me in." "Probably." Russ looked toward the road below. "Then why didn't you?" Nolan tightened the line around the anchor point before answering. "Because 4 people were on the pass." Russ gave a tired laugh. "So, now you're the man who always chooses right." "No." Nolan met his eyes. "I'm the man who doesn't get to decide your life matters less, because I'm angry." Foster took custody of Russ, while Rachel and Cal's evidence technician entered the relay room under documented access. The backup system was intact. It did not solve everything by itself. It did something better. It matched what they already had. Walter's field measurements showed the discrepancies. Walter's old report proved the first override had been a limited emergency exception. His later recommendation showed he wanted tighter controls. Eli's tablet showed change thresholds at 3 beacons. Judith's authorizations showed how access kept being approved. The relay archive supplied dates, technical credentials, and the sequence of configuration changes. Russ's decision to reopen West Pass during an active closure showed that the pattern had not stopped, even after the system came under scrutiny. When Cal arrived, Foster read Russ his rights and prepared the transfer. Russ looked once toward the old relay equipment. Walter changed 6, too. Nolan stood beside Rachel. Walter made one decision he spent the rest of his life questioning. Russ said nothing. Nolan continued. You made one decision and spent the rest of yours making everyone else live inside it. Nobody answered that. There was nothing useful left to argue about. Late that night, Nolan entered the community hall carrying cold air on his coat. Families slept on cots near portable heaters. Volunteers moved quietly between tables. Eli was awake near the radio desk, but Nolan barely saw him at first. Nell lifted her head from a blanket near the wall. Milo slept between her front legs. Nell looked down at the puppy. Then she stood and walked toward Nolan. No hesitation. No warning growl. She crossed the room and pressed the side of her shoulder against his leg. Nolan lowered himself beside her and rested one hand lightly against her neck. 3 days earlier, she had made him wait in the snow before allowing him close. Now, she had come to him. Nolan reached into his pocket. Aaron Dwyer's name was still there. It had been there every day. Nolan pressed the call button before he could turn the decision into another 3 years. The line rang twice. Then a familiar voice said, "Hello?" Nolan closed his eyes. Aaron. Silence. Nolan looked down at Nell beside him. I think I'm finally ready to talk about that night. The first thing Everpine changed was not a law. It was a password. 3 days after the storm, an independent inspection team arrived from the county seat with sealed laptops, replacement modules, and enough questions to make half the village realize how much of the beacon system had depended on habit. Beacon 3, 6, and 8 were taken offline one at a time. Their configuration modules were removed, cataloged, and compared against the relay archive, Walter Morrow's notebooks, Eli's tablet, and the current technical standards. West Pass reopened in short windows, only after Rachel Boone's field team verified conditions by hand. The arrangement frustrated almost everyone. High Basin employees lost shifts. The diner ran out of 2 regular menu items before the delayed food shipment arrived. A motel owner accused Cal Mercer of strangling the winter season. Another resident thanked him because her father depended on the medication that had been on the trapped supply truck. Everpine did not suddenly agree about what had happened. It simply could no longer pretend that opening a road and knowing a road was safe were the same decision. The new rules were written slowly. No company that profited directly from an open route could change safety thresholds alone. Manual overrides required 2 independent approvals. Significant technical adjustments generated automatic copies to the Avalanche office and county emergency management. Long-term backups were moved beyond the maintenance contractor's control. Judith Hale stood before the village council and admitted that several approvals had carried her signature, even though she had not understood their full effect. She did not blame Russ Cade for every piece of paper. She did not blame the size of the village either. I trusted familiarity where I should have required verification, she said. Judith stepped away from technical oversight, but kept her administrative job. Everpine still needed someone who knew which elderly residents required fuel deliveries, which bridge inspection was overdue, and which family could not afford another week without work. Responsibility, Nolan was beginning to understand, did not always require disappearing afterward. Russ's case moved into county and state channels. Nolan heard pieces of it through Cal. Misleading technical filings, unauthorized system changes, taking Eli's phone and snowmobile key, failing to report that Eli might be stranded, and reopening technical access on West Pass during an emergency closure. Nolan stopped asking for updates after the first week. Russ would have lawyers, hearings, evidence, and people whose job was deciding what each action legally meant. Nolan had spent too much of his life believing every consequence needed his personal supervision. He let this one belong to someone else. Walter's name took longer to settle. For several days, people repeated the easiest version. Walter had overridden Beacon 6, too. Then Rachel presented the complete sequence at a smaller public meeting. 7 years earlier, Walter had made one emergency decision after inspecting the slope himself. The ambulance crossed. Walter documented the choice, watched the conditions afterward, and then recommended tighter controls precisely because he understood how dangerous that kind of authority could become. Nolan sat at the back beside Eli while Rachel read Walter's words from the old report. The old man had not been spotless. That was what made the truth matter. Walter's value did not come from never being wrong. It came from refusing to convert one successful gamble into proof that he could never be wrong again. Nolan thought about that when Aaron Dwyer finally spoke on the phone. Their first call lasted 43 minutes. Nolan knew because the faded field watch on his wrist still kept perfect time, though for once he did not check it until after the line went quiet. Aaron did not make the conversation easy. "I was angry," Aaron said, "for a long time." Nolan sat alone at the kitchen table, while Nell slept near the stove, and Milo worried one corner of an old rug with his puppy teeth. "I know." "No, you assumed." Nolan said nothing. Aaron's voice had changed over 3 years, rougher around the edges, but the pauses were the same. Nolan remembered wading through those pauses before missions, because Aaron usually had something worth hearing after them. "There were days," Aaron continued, "when I thought if you'd waited 5 minutes, maybe I would still be in." Nolan's hand tightened around the phone. "Maybe." He did not mention the review board. He did not say that the intelligence picture had supported movement. He did not explain the pressure, the timeline, or what Nolan himself had carried afterward. "I'm sorry," Aaron breathed out slowly. "That's not the part that made me angriest." Nolan looked toward the window. "What was?" "You decided the rest too." Nolan did not understand. Aaron answered before he could ask. "You stopped answering. You left. You decided I'd be better off without you. You made that call for me, too." The kitchen seemed very quiet. Aaron said, "You didn't even let me decide whether I wanted you gone." Nolan looked at Nell. Her head rested on her paws, eyes half open. A week earlier, she had crossed a crowded room because Nolan had returned. The simplicity of that action had stayed with him. "I thought leaving was the one thing I could do right." "It wasn't." Nolan closed his eyes. "I'm sorry." Aaron did not rescue him from it. "It isn't okay yet." "I know." Another silence. Then Aaron said, "But next time you call, I'll answer." It wasn't forgiveness. It was better. It was a choice Nolan had finally allowed Aaron to make. By the time Eli was strong enough to return to regular work, Nell had regained much of her weight, and Milo had discovered stairs, boots, chair legs, and every object in Nolan's cabin that had never before required protection from teeth. Eli visited almost every day at first. He sat on the floor with Nell's head against his leg and let Milo climb across his boots. Nolan never asked what Eli planned to do with them. The question belonged to Eli, too. One afternoon, Eli finally brought it up himself. Before Walter died, Eli had accepted a communications job that would keep him away for weeks at a time. Walter and Eli had already discussed finding Nell a more stable home once Milo was old enough. Walter's death had interrupted the decision before either man was ready to make it. "I don't want to lose them," Eli said. "You don't have to." "That's not the same as being the person they live with." Nolan took several days before answering. Once, waiting would have felt like weakness. Now it felt like respect for the size of the choice. On the fourth morning, Eli came up the cabin steps and called Nell from the yard. Nell ran to him immediately, tail moving hard enough to swing her hips. Eli knelt, rubbed both sides of her neck, and laughed when Milo shoved between them, demanding equal attention. They spent an hour outside. When Eli finally stood to leave, Nell walked with him halfway to the truck. Then Milo barked from the porch. Nell turned. The puppy stood beside Nolan, one oversized paw hanging over the step. Nell went back. Eli watched her settle beside Milo, then looked at Nolan. She isn't choosing you instead of me. No? Good. Eli smiled faintly. Then maybe we stop making it a choice. Nolan became Nell and Milo's primary caretaker. Eli kept a key to the cabin and a place in their lives. Rachel later offered Nolan a permanent role with the mountain rescue volunteers. Nolan declined anything resembling command. He accepted logistics, backup radio, equipment transport, and route support. Rachel did not argue. The work required Nolan to report what he knew, admit what he did not, and trust someone else to make the final call. It suited him better than he expected. Near the end of winter, fresh snow covered the cabin steps before breakfast. Milo had grown taller, but not more graceful. His front paws still looked too large for him, and his right ear now stood, while the left leaned stubbornly outward. The moment Nolan opened the door, Milo launched himself into the new snow and sank nearly to his belly. He jumped once, accomplished nothing, then stared at the drift as if betrayed. Nell stepped outside more carefully. Her sable coat was thick again, the small honey-colored mark on her chest bright against the black fur. She checked Milo, then looked back at Nolan. His phone vibrated. A message from Aaron. Still snowed in up there? Nolan looked at it for a moment. Then he took a picture of Milo fighting his way through 18 inches of snow. You have no idea. The typing indicator appeared. Nolan smiled, slipped the phone into his pocket, and stepped off the porch before the reply arrived. Nell walked beside him. Milo bounded ahead. Nolan still remembered the night Aaron was hurt. He still knew there were choices he would give almost anything to make differently. But the worst decision of his life no longer had the right to make every decision that came after it. Inside the cabin, there were now muddy paw marks by the door, dog hair beneath the table, Eli's spare gloves on a hook, rescue radios charging beside the kitchen wall, and a phone Nolan no longer feared answering. The place Nolan had come home to hide in had become crowded with evidence that he had stayed. Sometimes the hardest choice is not the one we made in the past, but the one waiting for us today. Nolan could not undo what happened to Aaron. Walter could not erase the risk of his first override, and Everpine could not pretend its mistakes had never happened. What changed them was the willingness to stop defending the past and make the next decision with greater honesty, humility, and care for others. Most of us will never face a mountain storm or a rescue on a frozen pass, but we all know what it feels like to wish we had chosen differently. A mistake can become a prison, or it can become a lesson that helps us choose better when another moment comes. Thank you for spending this story with us. If it stayed with you, please share your thoughts, leave a comment, and consider subscribing so we can continue telling stories about loyalty, responsibility, and second chances. May the choices ahead of you bring more peace than the ones behind you. If you have any feelings, thoughts, or suggestions about this story, would you share them in the comments below so we can listen, learn, and keep making these stories better?